Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Lepre, here to narrate the master slideshow for final review. If you are taking the time to actually listen to me read 141 slides, that must mean you're either extremely desperate for some final review before the exam, or you really had nothing else to do, in which case I'll try to make this as entertaining as possible. So basically, this slideshow is just going to be me narrating and commenting on the information I put in the study guide for the final exam. I am not going to go over the vocab in this slideshow because the key questions in many ways talk about the vocab words. So this slideshow is basically going to go through the key questions, information related to them, and any other thing I think is essential for knowing on the final exam. So, without further ado, let's start with Unit 1. Unit 1, History Mystery, Introduction to 8th Grade Social Studies. I wasn't here for this unit. Feels like ancient history. For me, it was prehistory because I wasn't here. It is pre-Lepre history. So basically, this unit talks about some of the basics that go into acting or thinking like a historian. And one of the most basic things you needed to know was the difference between primary and secondary sources. So a primary source is an original document containing the observations, ideas, and conclusions of an individual. It is a first-hand account presented by someone present or actively participating in the event. A secondary source is a second-hand account of an event, or a retelling of another person's observations written by someone who did not witness or actually participate in the events. This includes sources that combine, synthesize, and/or interpret information from primary sources. Now, I have a brilliant example coming up. For those of you who have been in my class, you know that I like to reference Titanic way more than it deserves to be, even though it's a great film. So my primary source example is Rose. Rose's testimony as a survivor of the sinking of the Titanic is a first-hand account. She was a witness to the event, and her testimony counts as a primary source. A secondary source, for example, is this slideshow. How about that? A book, slideshow, or other source of information about an event that doesn't have a direct connection to the event, but writes about it based on information from primary and other secondary sources. Next, we have an overcomplicated diagram explaining the relationship between primary and secondary sources. Go through it at your own risk. It might actually end up confusing you more. If that's the case, then skip it. Historical context. Chronological events that provide a larger backdrop for a story or when a document was created. The when and what was happening around a document. The photos are self-explanatory. Chronological. Something arranged in time order from earlier events to later events. So in this case, we have Titanic hitting an iceberg, and then Titanic begins to sink after it hits an iceberg. These events are in chronological order. Analyze. To look at something carefully by paying attention to its parts. Example. If the treasure hunters from Titanic had analyzed Rose's story more closely, they would have realized she was still in possession of the heart of the ocean diamond and could have detained her and confiscated it before she tossed/dropped it in the ocean. Probably the most frustrating ending to a film there ever has been. Personal opinion. Analyzing charts, maps, and graphs. Look for titles, captions, dates, anything that helps you narrow down the meaning. These charts, maps, and graphs are all made for a reason. They all have some message they're trying to tell the viewer. This graph, for example, sends the message that unemployment went up due to the Great Depression, but because of World War II, employment rose again to produce war materials. Finding the point of view. Look at the ways in which an artist or author depicts or describes a person, place, or thing. Do they represent them in a positive way or not? This gives you the best clues at finding the point of view. In this Thomas Nast cartoon, Boss Tweed is shown in prison stripes inside a jail cell. It's pretty obvious that the point of view of the artist, Nast, is that of someone who is against Boss Tweed and thinks he's bad. Unit 2, Westward Expansion. I wasn't here for this one either. Except one day for Period 2. That's where I made my debut. Fun fact. First key question. What was the Transcontinental Railroad and why was it so important? A railroad that was completed in 1869 linking the east and west coasts of the United States. It was so important because it further united the country, making travel and trade faster and easier between the two coasts. It also signaled even worse times for Native Americans as they would continue to be forced to move to escape the rapid settlement of the West. What was manifest destiny and how did it impact westward expansion? Manifest destiny was the belief that American expansion in the West was both justified and inevitable, meaning we had every right to take this land and we would ultimately take hold of it anyway. This belief encouraged settlement of the West and motivated the government to expand the size of the country. How did the westward movement of settlers impact the environment and Native American populations? Railroads were constructed, settlers moved west in large numbers, and this devastated the buffalo population, basically to the point of extinction. Native Americans were once again forced off of their land, killed, and otherwise negatively impacted by westward expansion. Sad. What were some of the major reasons why people moved out west? Land, land, land. Also gold, spreading religious beliefs, exploration, adventure, hunting, jobs working on the railroads. Unit 3, big business. My first full unit here. I enter from stage right. First key question for Unit 3. What were the advantages of monopolies for the business owners that had them? A monopoly is when one business completely controls the production and sale of a particular product. The advantage of this for the business owner is that they can charge the customer as much money as they want because you can only buy the product from one business. Example. Over the summer, I plan to establish a monopoly over the infinity cube industry by infiltrating the highest levels of the fidget toy producing companies and merge them into one corporation called Industries under my leadership. The end result will be the end of Amazon or anyone selling these cubes for $10. Say hello to the $100 infinity cube. I will control the sale of all of them in this monopoly so I can set any price I want. Deal with it. If you want it bad enough, you just have to hand over Benjamin Franklin. It's that simple. How do monopolies negatively impact consumers? Consumers had fewer choices of what to buy, and they were forced to pay the high prices the monopolies demanded, like the $100 Lepre Infinity Cube, if they wanted to have the product. What did the government do to address problems resulting from the creation and expansion of monopolies? To protect consumers and prevent big business from getting too powerful, the government stepped in and broke up trusts and corporations to stop monopolies from forming. The government passed laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act, which gave them the power to break up large monopolies into smaller companies to increase competition and help consumers. So, for example, this is like the government stepping in to break up Industries, after I have formed a monopoly over the infinity cube market. The government sees that these products are popular and that I am hurting customers in competition by owning all of them and charging such a ridiculously high price. The government then uses the law to force my company to break up into smaller pieces so that no single company has total control over the infinity cube market. How were the big business leaders of the late 1800s viewed by the people? Big business leaders like Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and John D. Rockefeller were either viewed to be robber barons, which were greedy, corrupt businessmen, or captains of industry, wealthy individuals who did a lot to improve society through their hard work and donations to charity. So, for example, if I had a factory that was filled with all sorts of hazards, toxic fumes, and other dangers of the cube-making process, I might be viewed as a robber baron. But if I used the money I made and donated it to hospitals, I might be called the captain of industry. Who knows? Unit 4, Immigration and Labor. First key question. What were the major push and pull factors that caused huge numbers of immigrants to come to America in the late 1800s and early 1900s? Well, push factors were reasons why immigrants wanted to leave their original country. Pull factors were reasons why immigrants wanted to come to America. Examples are included on the next two slides. Push factors: war, poverty, religious persecution, disease, bad harvest, environmental disasters like earthquakes, corrupt or unjust governments. Pull factors: jobs, opportunities, freedom, land, democracy, peace. What was life like in America for new immigrants? Good and bad, mostly good. The good: jobs, money, freedom, opportunities. The bad: prejudice, discrimination. Cities were kind of disgusting and overcrowded. Working conditions were bad, unsafe, long hours. What major factors were part of the struggle of workers to get better working conditions? Workers formed unions, they went on strike, they protested and demanded better pay, less hours, and safer conditions. This eventually worked, but not before a few major happenings. Strikes had a huge impact on the labor movement. I just have two examples right here, the Pullman strike and the Great Southwest Railroad strike. You don't need to know them specifically, but just know that strikes had an impact. This one you do need to know. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. If you remember, we actually watched a video about this, how this was a factory that manufactured things called shirtwaists. They lock their workers in to prevent them from taking breaks, and naturally a fire starts, no one removes the chains, and the workers start to burn and jump out of the building. Very sad, very shocking. It kind of spurs some change in the country by motivating government officials to pass laws to make workplaces safer. And lastly, Haymarket Affair. This one not as important, but just a key event in the struggle for workers' rights because it involved a clash between police and laborers demonstrating for workers' rights. Unit 5, the Progressive Era. What did the progressives want the government to do in American society? The progressives wanted the government to play an active and energetic role in making people's lives better. They wanted the government to do something rather than nothing when faced with society's problems. So the progressive demand, don't just stand there, do something. That is the attitude progressives had. Before the progressives, the government was kind of unresponsive, very low energy. But in this case, the progressives would have made sure Willy Wonka's chocolate factory had followed safety regulations that made it impossible for children to be sucked into the factory's pipes. Although if we had progressives back then there had to be some other way for Augustus Gloop to be removed from the story. So maybe it was a good thing they weren't there. Key question. What were the major problems in America's cities and how did progressives try to fix them? Overcrowding, poor sanitation, unhealthy food, bad housing, tenements, crime, etc. These problems were fixed by better housing standards, hiring public sanitation workers, adding government regulations on food production, exposing the tenements and building better housing, reforming the police system to lower the crime rate, inventing the mugshot process. So remember how disgusted we all were from the gory details of the jungle when we read some of the excerpts in class and all the other unhealthy practices of the food industry? We even brought in Gordon Ramsay to show us just how bad kitchens can get even in the 21st century. Pretty bad. If you remember, there was that part that we read about how people could have body parts wind up in the sausage making process. Very disgusting. I don't think I'll ever go vegetarian, but hearing things like that opens my mind to it. So muckrakers, if you remember, they're the journalists who expose all these problems. They got involved and they exposed a lot of the disgusting abuses and corruption in these industries. The food industry is probably the most well-known example. And here we have some great raw primary source footage of Gordon Ramsay going after one of these corrupt food service workers. I am rooting him on. He knows exactly what he's doing. So how did the progressives view big businesses and monopolies? The progressives thought that many big business leaders were making society worse through their greed by bribing politicians and hurting regular people with monopolies that forced consumers to pay too much money. As for what they did about them, they dismantled or busted the trusts and became known as trust busters. Once again, I bring out some of the most exciting historical footage. This one was newly uncovered by me in some of the archives of the Library of Congress. We have some raw footage right here of the progressive trust busters taking out the Standard Oil Trust, 1911, colorized. Unit 6, Overseas Expansion and Imperialism. What were the major reasons why America began empire building in the late 1800s? Think of social, political, and economic categories. America wanted an overseas empire to gain wealth from controlling trade routes, the Panama Canal Zone in Panama, natural resources like sugar from Hawaii, and military bases, particularly in the Philippines, as a way to show their power to other global empires. What were the motivations for American imperial intervention in Hawaii, Latin America, China, and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean? Hawaii, we wanted sugar to sell. Latin America, the Panama Canal, we financed the construction. China, showing off how powerful we were by fighting in the Boxer Rebellion. And the Spanish colonies, free Puerto Rico and Cuba from alleged Spanish abuses of the people, free the Philippines also, but take control of it for military and trade reasons. So we just have Panama Canal. Just remember, it's in Panama, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. That's the Panama Canal today. And the next key question. What were the causes and effects of the Spanish-American War? Yeah, yellow journalism, fake news saying Spain was doing all sorts of crazy, evil things and we had to stop them. We also just wanted European countries out of the Western Hemisphere. The effects, America establishes itself as a world power and global empire. We get to sit at the big kids table now. Exciting. Alright. Unit 7, World War I. First key question. What conditions led to trench warfare and how was it finally overcome? Trench warfare resulted from the armies of World War I using old strategies that weren't able to deal with the limited advances in technology. This led to a stalemate. Now, there is a brief interlude, which I am going to skip. It is a flashback, and the only way, or the best way, to do flashbacks is to bring in some amazing Back to the Future references. I am not going to waste anyone's time by going through this. You can do that at your own risk, but we're going to skip ahead all the way to the rest of my explanation. Technology alone did not break the stalemate. A strategy needed to be created that matched the new technology. This strategy, infiltration tactics, was invented by Germany, who used specially trained soldiers, they called them stormtroopers, who had new technology like hand grenades, machine guns, mortars, etc., to punch narrow holes in enemy trenches that the rest of the army could use to break through without wasting tons of soldiers like the early days of trench warfare. Even though Germany was the first to use this strategy, they still wound up losing because they simply didn't have the resources to compete against the Allies, strengthened by America's late entry into the war. Second key question. What were the major causes of World War I? I shouldn't even have to go over this. We have the acronym MANIA. I'm taking this slide directly from what we did in Unit 7. Militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and most importantly, the most immediate cause, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Very few people realize this, but World War I, the beginning of it anyway, was telegraphed by a song, and I don't see how people didn't notice this at the time. Franz Ferdinand, Take Me Out, the song which started World War I. He was telegraphing all of his moves. Who would have known? Next, why did America ultimately decide to enter the war on the side of the Allies? What had Germany done to cause America to go to war against the Central Powers? Basically, their submarines, U-boats, were attacking ships in the Atlantic and kept killing Americans. Then, when it was revealed America might join the war, Germany offered an alliance with Mexico if they attacked the United States. This made American entry into the war certain. What was America's role in the peace process? Well, if you remember, Wilson offered his 14 points as a plan for peace, but they weren't all accepted. Wilson really wanted to create an organization that could resolve conflicts between nations peacefully. This was called the League of Nations, and it was adopted as part of the Treaty of Versailles, but the United States Senate refused to vote in favor of joining the League, so the U.S. was never a member. Unit 8, we are moving through this thing. This is actually probably going to be 3 times as long as I thought it would be, but what are you going to do? So Unit 8, the Roaring Twenties. What were the major reasons for the rapid expansion of business and wealth in the 1920s? Well, during the late 1800s, there were a lot of advances in technology and lots of money to go around to mass-produce things, making things in large numbers very quickly and at a low cost for people to buy. This resulted in the rise of consumerism, where regular people could buy or consume, hence the word consumerism, tons and tons and tons of different products, ranging from cars and radios to telephones and refrigerators. For a more detailed and engaging explanation, we need to go back to Unit 8. And this one I won't skip because there is some classic material in here which I do not want to skip over. So, economy of the 1920s, we have the Joker from Batman 1989. Overflowing with money. That is what the economy was like in the 1920s. America, richest country in the world after World War I. Things are going pretty good. Not everyone. A lot of people got incredibly wealthy. Not farmers, though. Farmers usually get the short end of the stick. Here's some examples of the types of products you could buy in the 1920s. You have cars, typewriters, early refrigerators, radios. It was a time where people had money to spend, and they had tons of things they could spend it on. I remember when we went through this in Unit 8, think in January or February, I used the example of these famous icons of American industry and business, the pitchmen who appear on the public access TV, but the infomercials. And my favorite, Billy Mays, legend. How do people pay for all this new stuff if they didn't have all the money they needed to buy it? Installment buying. Buying items on credit where you can pay for something in small payments later rather than paying for the entire thing up front. And this lets you party like it's 3 easy payments of $19.95. But wait, there's more. There was so much faith in the American economy that people didn't just buy products with money they didn't have yet. They also bought stocks in companies with money they didn't have yet. This was called buying on margin. Borrowing money in order to buy stock in companies on the stock market. People literally just got stuff nearly for free, simply by agreeing to pay for the full price, piece by piece, in the future. Trying to crash the 1920s economy? It's that easy. Next key question. What were the major culture clashes or generational differences between the generation of the 1920s and the one that came before? Well, the pre-1920s generation, the Victorian era named after Queen Victoria, traditional, strict, all about hard work and no play, not shopping, anti-alcohol, conservative style of dress, more religious. Roaring 20s generation, rebellious, free-spirited, wanted to party, were interested in sports and other forms of entertainment, wanted to buy stuff all the time, drank alcohol illegally, broke traditional fashion trends, kind of wild compared to their predecessors. What effect did the banning of alcohol have on American society in the 1920s? Crime, crime, and more crime. The time when alcohol was banned was called prohibition. People still wanted it even though it was illegal, so they had to buy it through criminals who broke the law. These criminals got very rich from selling alcohol in gangs as part of what is called organized crime. What changes in music, fashion, the arts, culture in general occurred during the 1920s? Why were they significant? Well, jazz became really popular as a new form of music. Women's fashion reflected less traditional attitudes. Shoulders showing, shorter dresses, shorter hair. Artists were less traditional in general. Abstract art became popular as opposed to more classical pieces of art. These changes were significant because they signaled a big change between the pre- and post-World War I generations. The best example of this was the Harlem Renaissance, a movement in the African American community where an entirely new and unique culture was formed by African Americans who had moved to northern cities like New York, settling in areas of New York City like Harlem, hence the name Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance centered around a modern 1920s culture based in jazz, modern literature, poetry, dance, fashion, etc. that reflected African Americans' experiences during the time. Unit 9, the Great Depression and the New Deal. What were the major causes of the Great Depression? Farm failure, bank failure, installment buying, buying on credit, buying on margin, overproduction. For a more detailed and logical explanation, we need to go back to Unit 9. Unfortunately, we're going to have to skip this one because it's extremely long and I just don't have the time to go through all of this. So you can do that on your own. We are going to skip way ahead to slide 108. What effect did the Great Depression have on the lives of regular people? What part of the country was hurt most? Tons of people lost their jobs. That's called unemployment. People were homeless. People were angry. Farmers were hurt the most. With farm failures in the Dust Bowl, these Americans lost their only means of support. Being far away from the cities, the only chance they had to make a living was by farming. The drought that caused the Dust Bowl destroyed farms and, by extension, farming jobs. What was the New Deal, and what did it do to American society? No, it did not end the Great Depression. The New Deal was FDR's plan to end the Great Depression, based on 3 R's, relief, recovery, reform. They're described right here. What did it do? Provided immediate relief to those hurt by the Depression, and it increased the government's role in the economy and everyday lives of citizens. But it didn't end the Depression. World War II ended the Depression by creating a huge demand for military supplies, soldiers, and jobs that ultimately fixed the unemployment problem and had a domino effect that helped spark an economic recovery. These elements, or those elements of the New Deal that have lasted the longest time, have been considered its most successful parts. Here are some examples. You don't need to know them for the final. Relax. If you remember, we talked about this back then. If you don't remember, you have to go back to Unit 9. It pains me to actually even include Tom Brady as a Jets fan, but I felt like it was a relevant example. What is one way to determine whether something is successful or not? Yeah, Tom Brady winning the Super Bowl in 2001, winning in 2016. And in this case, you have what is one way to determine whether something is successful or not. So it's the same question, but I'm showing you two different sets of images. Here we have the pyramids in 1850 and the pyramids today. And the answer, of course, is that they last a long time. So there's a big gap between Tom Brady's first Super Bowl and his hopefully last Super Bowl. And with the pyramids, they have lasted thousands of years. So you can kind of tell what is successful by what lasts the longest. Now, interesting thing about these photos is it brought back one of the more, I wouldn't call it a painfully funny memories, was when, I believe it was period 6, called me out. They realized that the photo I had used was the exact same photo. I just happened to crop it and make it black and white to make it appear older. Yes, I regret nothing about this. I could not find a photograph of the pyramids in 1850. They, of course, existed back then. I just couldn't find a photograph that old. And so I thought I could pull a fast one on everybody by just turning it black and white and cropping it to make it look like a different photo. But I underestimated your observation skills, and I was found out pretty quickly. So, shout out to period 6. If you were indeed the period that solved this low-level mystery. So, like I said, lasts a long time, like the parts of the New Deal that last to this very day. What were the major reasons people supported or opposed the New Deal? Supporters' arguments: it prevented the Depression from getting worse, it helped a lot of ordinary people survive, it set up a structure that still helps the working class and poor today. Opponents' arguments: it didn't actually end the Depression, it relied on spending money the government didn't have yet, that's called deficit spending. It made the government too powerful by giving it control over the economy it didn't have before. So remember, this debate still goes on between really knowledgeable people on both sides of the issue. Let's take a trip back to Unit 9. We're actually not going to do that because we have to move on, or I have to move on at least. So we're going to skip ahead to slide 122 with World War II. What factors led to the rise of totalitarian dictators? Anger and chaos in many countries after World War I resulted in a demand for strong leaders who could bring order and fix the problems. The economic disaster of the Great Depression pushed people to the political extremes to find a solution to the Depression. People lost faith in their governments to deal with modern problems and began to doubt the usefulness of democracy, especially in Germany, a new democratic country after World War I. What were the general stages of the Holocaust? What were the different steps in Germany's persecution of the Jews that ultimately ended with full-scale genocide? Well, the ladder of prejudice, which you all talked about in English, summarizes it pretty well. The Holocaust was not a random event, it was planned out and had an observable course that ultimately resulted in extermination. How did the situation of women, African Americans, and Mexican Americans all undergo changes due to the war? Well, all three groups were able to use the war to gain greater independence by working in jobs that supported the war effort. All three served in the military, the exceptions being that women were not allowed in combat roles and African Americans were segregated from white soldiers. And here we have classic. I don't think I only showed one of these in class. I really regret not showing the gold medalist, Kendall Jenner, giving Hitler a Pepsi to end World War II. You might think, according to the fake news media, that World War II ended with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviets taking over Berlin, but here we have authentic, non-fake news history. So it was Kendall Jenner who ended World War II. Unit 11, Post-War Challenges, the last unit, exciting. We're almost at the end. Why were the United States and Soviet Union at conflict after World War II? What forced the conflict to remain cold? Well, America was democratic and capitalist. The Soviet Union was a dictatorship and communist. Each side wanted their ideas to be in power after World War II was over. This conflict first showed itself in the controversy over what kind of country Germany should be after Nazism. Germany is ultimately split into two countries, the democratic West Germany and communist East Germany. The fact that both sides had incredibly destructive nuclear weapons forced the conflict to remain cold. This meant that the USA and USSR would never directly go to war against each other, but fight indirectly in smaller wars around the globe, like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, etc. How and where did the United States put the policy of containment into action? What were the results? Cold War hotspots. We used the military and diplomacy to contain the spread of communism. In the case of the two Berlin hotspots, the Berlin Airlift and Berlin Wall, we didn't have to use the military. We used diplomacy to prevent West Berlin from becoming communist. In Korea and Vietnam, we used the military to try and contain communism. It was successful in Korea, not successful in Vietnam. If you have trouble remembering what containment is and what it did, let's take a trip back to Unit 11. This one we won't skip because it's just great. It is peak mimification of history. So what does containment actually look like in practice? Essentially, it's a giant T-pose. American diplomacy and military cornering communism and containing it to that corner. So, assert your dominance over communist countries around the world by containment T-posing. Keep these governments cornered and unable to spread their communism elsewhere, and you're well on your way to putting yourself at the top of the Cold War era hierarchy. Also, please don't forget our Cold War hotspot mascot, Guy Fieri. Really a fortuitous turn of events that brought Guy Fieri into our lives. He is the perfect mascot for the Cold War era hotspots. Let's just not forget him. What were the goals and methods used during the Civil Rights Movement? How successful were they? Well, the goals: civil rights, full voting rights, equality, and anti-segregation. Methods: nonviolent protests like marches, sit-ins, boycotts, civil disobedience, etc. Were these methods successful? Yep. They brought attention to the issue and pressured the government to sign laws protecting civil rights, like the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. What were the similarities and differences between the two most prominent civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X? Well, King supported the use of nonviolent protest, never willing to use violence to achieve civil rights goals, wanted full integration of American society, and not one based on the separation of races. Wanted to improve the lives of African Americans in a way that was based on peace and justice. Malcolm X, on the other hand, didn't really like the idea of nonviolence. He thought it was weak and ineffective, very low energy, was willing to use violence to defend his rights, didn't really want integration, and preferred to be apart from white Americans. He just wanted to improve the lives of African Americans by any means necessary. And we should remember that was his motto, by any means necessary. If you've gone through this entire slideshow and feel like you need to do more for review, I highly suggest you go back to slide number 1 and review the entire thing again at your own risk. Or, now here's the plot twist. You could wait for the secret after-credits scene. Well, here are the credits. And the after-credits scene, if you're wondering what it is, you're actually watching it right now. I know your mind is blown. And Westworld starts in 3 minutes, so I need to wrap this up. Good luck on the final. And I hope this was productive for you. Running 3 times as long as I thought it would. But then again, you can't plan these sort of things out. Or when you do, nothing ever goes according to plan. Or the love plan. Thanks for watching.